So welcome to this talk on advanced stages of whole being realization at this Canadian Rockies online retreat 2020. It'll be fun for me to share with you some of the clarifications that have been arising over the last few years in my own process and then in my own description that has found its way into a map that reflects this unfoldment called the Whole Being Evolution Map. And today we're going to go look specifically at the awakened realizations, beginning, of course, with whole being realization. And I consider these elements that I will share with you, these realization components, as archetypal shifts, not kind of gradations, but actually distinctive shifts with distinctive characteristics that is available to everybody and requires whatever time it takes for us to have that whole being realization clarified within us, to go through the integration and meeting more of our material that becomes available with our whole being realization, and find distinctive shifts that can occur that continue following that whole being realization. They may occur in sequential order, or you may find flashes or glimpses or realizations, but not fully on a foundation. And I will share them with you in an order that reflects the grounded, integrated realization that precedes the next integrated realization. And so this will make more sense when I show you these charts, and that's probably the best way for me to do it in a short period of time, is just to kind of go through them with you and give you a taste, and it'll give a chance for discussion as we wish, as you see these. So let me start with sharing the screen. This is my starting page so that we know we're in this talk tonight. And I'm going to start off with the screens that reflect awakened whole being realizations. So whole being realization. This is where we meet the inner paradox, or what feels like an inner split. We might call it, as we've discussed, a wound, a confusion, a separation. Ultimately coming to hold consciously this inner sense of self as a paradox that we can hold consciously and find a ground of wholeness. And that wholeness reflects consciousness, embodiment, and mutuality. And I'm going to show you the names of these stages as they come along. Each has a complex unfoldment and has distinctive characteristics that reflect each of the three petals of the trillium flower that are realized in each of these particular shifts. So when we shift into whole being realization, there is a significant integration period that occurs. The name wake down, shake down that's sometimes referred to, or the process of reconfiguration, is one where we shift into this whole being condition and then find that in that evolutionary opening, more of what needs to be met within us to feel well, to feel grounded, can show up. For some, it can be very strong, and for some, it's just noticing the confusion, you could say, the oscillation between infinite and finite. We know we've awakened and we feel the expanse of wholeness, and we notice that we stub our toe and it really bothers us, and that's what we notice. So that is what goes on through an extended period of time. So we say in Trillium work, it can be 4 to 7 years. That's just kind of a frame of reference to get the idea that it takes months and even years to feel fully established in the ground. Well, that ground has distinctive aspects that may be noticed for some as a shift, as it was for me, or it just might be kind of an oozing into a next established stable state. And that, or stage, I should say, and that is whole being continuity realization. It reflects the ground, has a seamless nature to it, despite any fluctuations that may still occur in life. Issues come, relationship problems happen, money is an issue, but the ground is stable. So in the whole being realization, we find, this is great, I'm whole, consciousness, embodiment, mutuality, and then, oh my gosh, that person hurt my feelings, and oh, I've lost my awakening, but no, I haven't. And that kind of oscillation, the both are true, both are held, and they go through an extended period of integration that is automatic if we continue to do what we did preceding whole being realization. And that is continue to meet in mutuality, continue to green light the process as it shows up, continue to connect with transmission that can help us unfold our wholeness. And at some point, we can realize that we're in a different stage of our experience, where the whole being realization has become a continuity realization, a ground that we can count on that doesn't get lost. I might be focused on doing my taxes and I can't think of anything else, but there's no question that it's part of the continuity of this realization. Now that provides the ground for the next realization. And that's the whole being heart realization. Now people may find heart openings come during their whole being realization or during this integration and the shift into continuity realization. But I would say that you can't have the full whole heart realization without the full whole being realization established and stabilized. So the heart may be opening in the earlier stages, and for some might show up early or later, but having it established as a known range of the nature of self requires the establishment and integrated condition of whole being realization. Now there's so much more I could say, so I'm going to just stick to this unfoldment so that we have a frame of reference, and then I can answer questions. But there are distinctions about this realization and perhaps some surprises, because people have typically in the spiritual realm and in all realms thought of as heart as the realization of the flow of love, the interpersonal field of love, the heart chakra. But whole being heart realization is a realization of three fundamental dimensions of our awakening in the area of the heart. So that interpersonal, emotional dimension of realization is one. The conscious field being discovered as a field that holds and includes an impersonal, you could say, collective love or unconditional love for all it is not that emotional flow. It's actually a condition of awareness. And the third component in our embodiment is the discovery of embodied love. Our being is love. And it's not an emotional condition, it's a sense or sensual truth of the fabric of our existence is love. So each of these realizations has these distinguishing elements that fall into each of the dimensions of whole being. And there are ways to bring attention to that when one is in that condition of ripeness for that. Despite whatever heart openings may have already been occurring, there's a beauty and a thrill to find this discriminations of the heart and love not limited, crossing all boundaries, but having distinctive recognitions through our ground of our awakening. And that can emerge into the whole being fire of life realization. This is where we shift from realizing initially here the core paradox at our ground to, in whole being continuity realization, beginning to realize that our personal feeling intimacy with the paradox changes our sense of the paradox over time to being a triadox. Paradox, two elements that can't be merged, but are always there together, unmergeable. Well, what we might discover is that as we get grounded, integrated, living that continuity realization, we begin to have a more intimate recognition of the paradox, infinite and finite. Our relationship to it, if we feel further separated from it, we feel more uncomfortable. When we move closer to it, meaning we're more surrendered in it, we feel more ease, more wholeness. So we can discover that actually this paradox that we have been holding, we become part of a triadox, three elements that are unmergeable, but are actually inseparable. Well, when we come to this stage of whole being heart realization, that triadox, that infinite, finite, and self, when self is discovered as core love, then you have a trinity. When that's held fully, then you find a fire of a trinity of consciousness, beingness, and universal love. Now, fire is the best term that we could imagine, because it's actually, life is arising from this trinity, a dynamic, alchemical, ever unfolding exchange of origin, of source into form, always consciousness, beingness, and loveness, inseparable and unmergeable, always alchemical, arising and manifesting in creation. And the beauty that can happen at this point is a shift from holding core paradox, holding the triadox, finding our ground in love, to discovering this trinity that's emerging as creation, emerging as self, in which we can stop thinking or holding or being aware of it on purpose and start to live the joy, the exhilaration of being. And none of these are beliefs or acceptances, they're discoveries. They're unfoldments that occur on the ground of a realization, a deepened integration, a discovery of the nature and fabric of love, and then the combination or the fundamental trinity underlying us that emerges in the expression of life, in this case called the fire of life, as a reflection of that alchemical engagement. Now this, you could say, or I could say, is the pinnacle of self-realization. In other words, we have been pursuing the further and further realization of and through ourself. Here, we have realized and become creation manifesting. We've actually recognized our creation point, fundamental, at what previously might have been noticed as a core split or a core wound, that becomes a core paradox, a core triadox, core love, and then this core trinity or creation point. Well, when we come here and begin to live, and the realization is not the same as the living of it, because there's a certain amount of synthesis that needs to go on, integration, synthesis, refinement. As that goes on, then we can begin to be the living of it. The living of it is like the pinnacle of self-realization. It is the individual self becomes creation expressing in the form that the self is. So, at least for me, much to my surprise, because it never had been previously a part of my spiritual path, there began to appear the recognition of that which was beyond self, no self. And that is not something that whole being realization was headed towards, I thought. But the beauty of having a fulfilled kind of integrated recognition of being also opened the door. That doesn't need to be protected or owned, or it's just what is. A discovery of also no self, that which actually in the whole being characteristics that compose self, there is the element of no self. So emptiness, isness, oneness, beyond the self, that's just true. And that's can be confusing to the self, but not threatening. If this whole being fire of life realization is well integrated and being lived, then there's no need to defend it. It just is what is. And so if no self is discovered, it's, oh my gosh, knowing no self. And which is true? Well, both are true. There's just a truth to it. Realizing the creation emergence of form and that which is beyond the individual nature of it. And so what should be done? Well, nothing needs to be done. There's no threat. There's the beauty of being the fire of life, and there's a remarkable freedom of no self. And when those can be held, this and this, you can move into a synthesis that comes into living self, no self, the living of the two together. Or together, meaning at the same time, but not together. This and this. It's strangely like the realization of another paradox. Just the truth of existence in its most manifest creation, in its most clear expression of source emerging, and then no self emerging. And there's a certain joy and freedom and love and just living what is in existence, this range. The self has the capacity to not have to give it, to dismiss anything. You don't have to get out of being self because that essence is true and no self is true. The living of these innocently, perhaps with curiosity, over time can bring about a whole being essence realization. Essence is where creation as its expression, as the fire of life or the fire of creation with no self-realization together, something goes on, some kind of synthesis where source and existence find a continuity. You could say it's almost like another level of continuity realization, only now it's the continuity of source arising and being creation simultaneously. And it's remarkable because then there is that's where, to me, the sacred shows up. So, or you might call it the sacred marriage that you've heard. It's lovely to talk about it at other stages, but this is you could say the marriage of manifest creation and the unmanifest source, somehow continuous into form, the form that we've realized. And that feels like a fulfillment of realization until the possibility emerges or is recognized of this sacred essence that we have realized the sacred essence of creation that we've realized, we can realize sacred essence as self. And that is another level of the fulfillment of self-realization, where we realize that as the fire of creation or the fire of life, realization, finding the other, no self, finding together that we've realized this field of essence, a continuity or continuum of source right through existence. And then the shift into actually the discovery of sacred heart seated in our chest, that is actually the seat of the divine. You could say the link with source, divine, whatever word you use for it, is actually the spark of life is seated in our chest as a sacred heart. This is different than whole being heart realization. This is the seat of sacred as self. And that's a beautiful completion of the path of existence, emerging from source and rediscovering source. Whatever languaging people use for source. Now let me just kind of keep going, because I'm painting a picture, and then we can talk about any of these pieces as we wish. This is where we're coming into fulfillment of the sacred nature of life. And we actually become awake as sacred essence. That sourceness and the subtlest manifest is awake as us, we are awake as it. This is where the continued synthesis and refinement of these realizations can become what I've called sacred fulfillment, with distinctive characteristics that would, are part of something that could be expressed in detail at a longer period. But for now, just to say sacred fulfillment. Sacred fulfillment doesn't mean now being not finite in a particular name, age, gender, culture, but it means knowing as an intensity of the truth of the sacred nature of self, all it is, and being awake as all that. Now, I'll just give you a glimpse of the distinctions of each of these. I could, unfold them with care and talk about them, but we've got an evening of a certain length. So I'm just going to show you a chart that shows the dimensions of realization that are archetypal incremental shifts, from what I can tell, that have distinctive realized characteristics in each of these. And let's look at them, and I'll just kind of maybe speak them out so you have a sense of that. So awakened realizations. So whole being realization, you'll be familiar with this, is a realization of transcendent awareness, conscious embodiment, and non-separate interconnection. There's different languaging we can use, but when we have a whole being realization clarification conversation with folks, this is what we're looking for. And I'm now trained and qualified in that clarification conversation process, and these terms to me reflect what we are looking for people to express in their own language. They may have languaging and clarifications that are well beyond that, but we look for this, that field of awareness that interpermeates everything, including self, that one's own form and body is interconnected with the conscious nature, and that we are in relationship to everything. Our realization is included the truth of all as one, but always interconnected. We don't lose ourself or the other. So as a realization of that field that somehow is intimate and familiar to us without losing the differences. So the shift into whole being continuity realization, that for me, I remember when it completed. I remember the week when it completed, because I'm a curious, discriminative guy, and it's kind of like, okay, it's been some years and this is fluctuating, and I know that, it must make sense. It should settle at some point. And then this 1 week where 1 week, it probably was 1 day, but I remember the week when it happened. And then I started to realize, oh gosh, here it is. A ground of continuity. And as I discriminated what was the nature of this now, it was all-inclusive awareness, established in the ground of being, and knowing the fabric of interconnectedness. It's not just having interconnection that's non-separate, but it's the fabric, the non-separate field that has all these points of creation included and interrelated in them. And then the heart realization that began for me during my whole being realization unfolded further, another dimension. The first one dimension in the whole being realization, another dimension of the heart flourished and became clear to me during the continuity realization. And then just following the continuity realization, the final kind of dimension showed up as a clarity. And I found this whole heart realization then established and clear, discriminatively true, because of the different quality of each dimension of our work. And so unconditional love is a truism from that position of consciousness seated in the heart, perhaps the right-hand side of the heart, flavored by love and inclusive of all, holding all, interconnected with all. Interpersonal love, or let me just say embodied love, as the discovery of core love within, in which it's not an emotion, it's a resonance with the heart nature. It's like every cell. Nothing is excluded from the material of love as self. And then the interpersonal love, in which I felt like that had been there because I've had love in my life, and it was unfolding, and so I felt like that was established. But the final kind of click of that category was when unexpectedly, unlooked for, I recognized I was loved by being. I was loved by all it is. I loved all it was, and I was loved by it. It was a remarkable, unsought for recognition. And it felt like the fulfillment of interpersonal recognition, of that interpersonal dimension with the finite, could be with the snail, the blade of grass, the other person, the devas, the gods and goddesses, all it is. And that core love, on the ground of this realizing the connection, or the triadoxical connection with infinite and finite, then became, when that was established, began to be infinite, finite, and love as a nature, which is the shift into the fire of life realization. And so that the discriminative elements of that realization, infinity, creation, and adoration, as the three petals of that realization. And then the discovery of that which is beyond self showing up. And for me, they showed up over different stages of my unfoldment, from whole being realization to clarifying now. After whole being, fire of life was kind of unshakable, then noticing what was beyond it. Emptiness, never a part of my path, but a part of many paths, and yet just true. Isness, the isness of existence, beyond trust in existence, just the is of isness of existence. And then beyond I love and the flow of love, just the oneness, the intimacy of all at the same time, beyond self. And the holding of these two to discover whole being essence realization as sacred source, sacred fire, sacred love, not as separate elements, but as a singularity of non-separate items that each had these distinctions of the three dimensions of a realization. And then to find sacred essence realized as self, and I don't know that it's necessary for it to be so clear, but this is the doorway it came through for me, as the sacred heart of self seated in the chest, kind of the seat of the divine, or the of source, spark of life in self that sits in everyone. It's never not there in any form of life. It's just the kind of the waiting for that realization. You know, in a sense, we are our own savior as we find the divine seated, always the spark of who we are. And those elements that just were clear, sacred love of life. It can mean love of life, but it actually means love of life, the love nature of life, the sacred fire of creation, and the sacred source of all burning within the sacred heart of self. Intimately, inseparably connected to source without any need to give the refined, subtlest aspect of creation or manifestation. And then the one more thing that I wanted to show you to bring this all together was to just re-look at these realizations and see what I discovered later as their interconnectedness. So I'm just going to show you this. This is called insight, or it's an insight chart, and it's the idea is that long after this map was completed, with many elements that show the processes that are preceding each shift of realization, the synthesis part that happens after each realization, the attainment and the refined condition that we could recognize as the way it's lived. There are all these elements showed up and became clear and refined. But it was only later that I saw the beauty of the interconnection, the beauty of these archetypal elements and their interconnection. And so whole being realization, emerging to whole being continuity realization, which reflects the foundation of our realization as we know it. Consciousness, you could call it embodiment, but I call it beingness, and mutuality. These are the three petals of the trillium flower. These are the fundamentals that have been realized since Waking Down was founded by Sanyal. Consciousness, beingness, and mutuality. Well, one day, it was actually on a day when I was going to teach the Transfiguration Retreat in Olympia, as I was thinking about a presentation in this area that I was going to make, all of a sudden, these pieces seemed to be connected in a way I hadn't expected. It was a discovery. And what the discovery included that the awakened fulfillment of this mutuality dimension of our whole being continuity integrated realization, that mutuality dimension gets realized in a new way as whole being heart realization. Oh my goodness, a whole dimension is realized in this from this dimension of our realization. And then beingness emerges as the whole being fire of life realization. And consciousness shows up as whole being no self-realization. They totally correlate, and they're naturally absolutely synchronous with them. And then I found naturally they meet in whole being essence realization. And these colors were already part of the map because each of these elements was composing essence. And then just to see how, okay, they follow right naturally out of a whole being realization that's integrated into continuity, the fundamental dimensions that have been realized, each have their own realization. Each of them have their own realization, and those three meet up in whole being essence realization, which is fulfilled in the self as sacred essence realized as self, intimately connected with source. So it feels really thrilling and exciting to find that what started out as a seeking of, for me personally, awakening or realization, enlightenment, found its way into this path of whole being realization, and then found whole being realization and found that integration was relieving and completing and fulfilling, opening this, the self into being whole. And this whole being realization, for me, my perspective, well integrated, is a step of fulfillment. It's where life is smooth, where issues come and go without us having to work much on them. Life is in flow, and circumstances support whatever is next for us. So that ground of fulfillment doesn't need more, you could say. That's what I found. It didn't need more. However, what a pleasure to find this dimension of heart showing up earlier, and then as all-inclusive of the nature of awakened life and of manifest life. But it wasn't needed. This is a condition of completion in the fullness of this integrated realization. But what a lovely enrichment to find whole being heart, the creation point arising as life. And no self, not a problem, but as a filling out that which can be realized by the self. All of what could be realized, all beyond self. And then to find that the self that's realized those things can rediscover them as a continuum of source, the sacred, as a flow and continuum into all it is in creation. And that sacredness to be seated as a spark of life in every person, realizable in its own due time, with no need to get there, but just the joy of continued evolution. So that's the layout of it. And let's see how it's striking you. If you have questions, objections, wonderings, investigations about what you've experienced at various points and may see unfolding. I'm open to you and your comments. Yes, Marlene.
So I just want to clarify. I think what you're saying is that these stages happen organically. No one has to do anything. It's going to happen. You can't avoid it, prevent it, fuck up, and it won't happen.
There are ways.
Oh no, come on.
The ways are simple, and it's just one's curiosity and leaning in.
Right, to just continue to be in the growth process, basically.
Yes. And I found that there are some distinctive ways to do that that are placed in this whole being evolution map, but that I like to contribute to people's processes. When they're in their whole being realization stage, there are some orientations that can further support cooperation. We have people who are shifting into their whole being realization. They know they have to integrate, but the focus is so much on integration and wanting to get on with life that sometimes it misses the lovely nature of dropping deeper into what got us there. So the the job of going and doing the down work because I feel uncomfortable in my whole being realization and I've got these things, that's only one side of the picture. The other side is beginning to notice and live the realization, to begin to feel the spontaneity of life and begin to express it, to recognize inspiration and express that inspiration. So these are just samples, Marlene, of things that I would point people towards so that whatever's drawing our attention, if we're in the midst of a really challenging period and it looks like we've got to really kind of be present with our discomforts, that's so honorable. And those discomforts are drawing our attention to dropping further, whereas we may have been holding this as unfinished for life. Well, it is unfinished. We're not going to solve the core paradox, but we are going to discover its transformation. And that's crucial channel. We thought realizations, okay, I got to do more meditating or more love, you know, but actually for whole being embodied realization, the most significant channel is following creation itself. Creation means where we're uncomfortable, we're separated from the source of creation. So if we follow it and honoring it, green lighting it, and we can do that generally with the support of a coach who has that grasp that we're going to the inner core, not because it will never change, but because it will transform. It will never go away, it's creation, but it will be discovered in changed values as we're more intimate with it. So those, Marlene, are a few examples of how, in a variety of ways, we can support our attention. That isn't different, but it is different in terms of angles and understandings that I believe can really enhance the opening more rapidly, because we're adding a dimension of attention that otherwise we might not do and might be more embedded in the resolutions of discomforts that are practical than the living the awakening that's arising. And so then, if it's okay, there are ways to note or to lean into or recognize the dimensions of heart. The realizing the fields that we have that are us now. You know, the field of consciousness is me. The field of embodiment is me. The field of mutuality is me. Not that I've just realized them, but finding out I live with those dimensions. Well, as that became a curiosity to me, then I could notice the flavors of love. It was kind of like, oh yeah, this relatedness, I feel it's like a fabric and an interconnection. Oh yeah, I get this. But this one of my own nature, I don't know about that one, you know, like, and the unconditional love, what about that one? Well, the starting to notice our nature in these distinctive flavors, at least in my experience, invited the discovery of flavors of love into each one. So it's a non-effortful process. At this stage, Marlene, I'm just talking about interest and curiosity. And every other stage has a leaning that I could describe to you, but it gets less and less doing, or we're already out of doing, but it's even less and less. It's more the pleasure of, the flow of, but the attention makes a difference. And it's been a thrill for me to have my companionship of Ralph Humphreys, a mentor in the Trillium work, was working with me to create the New Principles of Awakened Relationship book. And then as the charts and the map began to emerge, he was a companion for me and a sounding board, an interlocutor kind of support, questioning me. And what I found over these 2.5, maybe going about 3 years now, is that his awakening was accelerated. He was starting to go through each of these stages. Why? Because perhaps he feels that the map itself was activating, because our awakening occurs by awareness. You know, fundamentally, that's all that's going on right from the beginning, before whole being realization. Different ways of allowing awareness. So you know, he can speak for himself, but he's said it already numerous times. The map was activating because he could see the discriminations. His own awareness was picking it up. Things that he might not have noticed were already showing up in some partial or merging form, and they help to bring it into lived condition. So I think there are things that can be done, but as you say, it's no rush. In fact, there's no need. If you really have that integrated ground, to me, that's a fulfillment stage. That's what it felt like to me. If we're still yearning for something, we're probably not fully integrated in that stage. But also, I'm a curious guy. You know, that's what I'm like. I've got this curiosity and investigation. So it definitely played a very rich role for me in discovering love. Love that I didn't think I'd open to when I had my whole being realization, and then started to notice these elements and got curious. How do they correlate with me? What about my channel of mutuality? What about my channel of embodiment? Where's love? You know, what about this field of consciousness? But it was no effort. It was an adventure, I would say. So you're right on. And I think there are, especially at the earlier stages, angles of attention that if one is interested, you know, can support something flourishing through awareness. Yes, Sonia.
You talk about sacred and sacred heart, and this is the first I hear that word in this context. Can you say more about sacred?
I could, and I even tell the story of that specific time of realization that is available in certain materials that I can tell people about at another time. But just in briefly, well, how brief can you be? Let's just say that, okay, I'll cut out all of the lovely components of it just to go to the place where that became clear. And I was in this special setting, special set of circumstances, in a special land, in a Greek Orthodox location on a hill, on a mountain, where nobody else was except my love and I. And there was a cave. It was a mystery school cave from the 1300s, and it had a beautiful little church up on the, just over there, just up above. And it overlooked the Mediterranean Sea. It was a remarkably beautiful location. And there were speakers, and there was this a remarkable music of Greek monks chanting. And I've heard monks chanting before. This was the most beautiful I'd heard. And Andrea felt it was the most beautiful she'd heard. So this is the environment. We come into this space, and this beautiful space, and then there's this cave. You know, it's kind of like a room size. So we go in there, and it's got some Catholic icons, but it has mystery school dimensions. There's candles burning. It's not like a church so much as a representation of something. And there's these two little stumps, tree stumps on the ground in the cave. And so we went in there and we sat down silently. And, you know, being a person oriented towards the inward path, I thought, well, I think I should meditate. And so I closed my eyes, and it brought me to something that I had been carrying for a year before. I was visiting in Spain with Andrea, and we went to this cathedral, I think it's a cathedral, on Montserrat Mountain near Barcelona. And that hermitage has been going for 800 years. And they have a boys' choir that has been going that long there. And we went into the cathedral, and people were pouring in, and we discovered the boys' choir was going to sing. And so I'm not familiar with the Catholic teachings. I had a Protestant upbringing, liberal Protestant, and left that behind when I became an adult. So it was interesting to be there, and there was people pouring in, and there was these icons. And I've been to a lot of churches throughout Europe, And I always found it curious that there was this suffering represented at the front, you know, Christ on a cross, usually bleeding, you know, it portrayed suffering to me. I never got it. But in this church at this time, I saw these sincere people, and I saw Christ, and he had a bleeding heart, you know, it's kind of a wounded heart. And then these folks, and then the boys' choir sang, and it was just celestial, you know, the first piece in particular. And in that, seeing the sincerity of everyone, I was kind of looking back towards everyone, and then seeing these icons and wondering, you know, what is it that they're looking for? I felt the deep suffering of people's hearts, you know, humanity's suffering and wanting relief. And it's something I hadn't really tuned into before until then. And it was so touching. And then later when I left and we were traveling on, and actually for the next year, it was kind of like a curiosity. The map was pretty much finished, and I'm thinking, you know, what is that suffering heart, the suffering of humanity, wanting to be saved? You know, it didn't trouble me. It just got my curiosity going. So in that cave, when I was sitting on that stump with the music pouring in, and, you know, the candles burning, and just feeling the draw to meditate, as I sat there with my eyes closed, that thought that I'd been carrying just popped up about, oh, the suffering of humanity, and their yearning to be saved, and that suffering of Christ, and whatever that might mean. What was that? And so I just kind of let myself drop. And as I did that, I felt into my own heart. What was it wanting? And it wasn't actually wanting anything. It was completely clear. No pain, no hurt, no need, just open. And so I just settled into it. And I thought, geez, you know, what is it that people are yearning for? You know, obviously it wasn't in words. It was in just attention and awareness. And as I sat there wondering, they want something from this symbol, this symbolic figure, or this figure that's been taught to have the saving or the connection with God. And as I felt, okay, my heart's not looking for anything. And then I thought, what are they looking for? And I felt the missing piece. It was like a gap, a missing piece. It was like, and I've sometimes used this word, it was like, I want mother to be at home. You know, that terminology being like when you're a kid and you're at home, and then you want mother to be home when you come home from school, kind of feeling. If mother's at home, doesn't matter whether you get along or she does anything. I can remember that from myself. I feel okay. Well, I felt something like that, like, oh my gosh, I feel the gap with source. It was like it had some kind of components to it. It was like, I'm here, my heart's open, and oh, there's something more. Like more that this heart would love to have. And in that moment, this spark that I call, in the form that it showed up for me, this ribbon of love emerged from source into my chest, and I discovered right there was this burning heart. It was the center of love, the fire of life burning, and the oxygen of source as a sacred heart burning in the self that needed nothing else. It was the spark of life. And that spark came through the doorway of love, but there's never one by itself in creation. There's always a trinity in creation. But the activator, the catalytic force being love, and our life is always like a kind of the sacred emerges as a spark of love in the fire of the manifest creation existence in the field of consciousness. You know, and after a while, I opened our eyes when we went out into the surrounding. We went up to the church, lit a candle. It's just a little church, could only hold a few people, but fully formed. And then we left, as we were leaving that whole open area amongst the trees. Then the first people we saw were just starting to come up to this opening, and we were just leaving. So we'd been there all that time by ourselves. And then when we went back into this old town, this old Greek town, seeing all the people, it was just, to me, self-evident. Everyone had this Sacred Heart burning as the source of life in them. It was just obvious. How can I say that? It just was. It didn't matter whether they were a tourist or whether they were a street person, what they did, it didn't matter. We were all walking around as the spark of life in us that we wanted to be saved by somebody else's heart. You know, whereas that representation of that realized man was an example of what we all are and have as the sacred spark within us. So this is really, from my perspective, the Sacred Heart of Self. And whether that becomes clear to others in that same way doesn't matter. What matters is our recognition of the sacred that I don't think can fully show up without the realizations integrating, the knowing of heart, the heart realization, which is actually the realization of self leading to being the fire of life. The Sacred Heart is found not as a heart awakening, but as the seat of the sacred spark of life that is us when we realize it. You're welcome. And as Marlene pointed out, you know, we're not actually creating our awakenings; we're allowing them. So, you know, she was pointing out we're being easy with ourselves, and we're being intentional because we can't not do it. The force of evolution is calling us to find relief, and that relief is giving us the gift of connection with the creation that arises as us, and the spark of life that is us. And none of this needs to be believed, but I think we all understand that these are shifts of realization, and each person will likely have their own language, just like the whole being realization has its own language. Each person tells their story using their own languaging, their own set of circumstances, their own timelines. But we can find the commonality that people can talk in their own language in whole being realization about transcendent consciousness. They can talk in their own ways of describing it about conscious embodiment, and they can describe, you know, non-separate interconnection. And it gives us this common recognition of an archetypal shift of realization. So each of these has these distinctive, you could say, like quantum shifts. They're different. They're shifts of realization that we can investigate together by each person having their own language, their own story of finding heart nature or sacred heart. We're free to just paint the canvas of realizations in any form we want. And it is beautiful to have a way to talk in common that helps us discriminate and include the richness of the three dimensions of existence and of our realization at every archetypal shift. So that's what the map offers us, is a common tool to talk about these things and an activator for our own discovery in our own language and our own time. Any more thoughts, questions, comments? Yes, Ardith.
I'm laughing because I'm wondering what is going to come through you next.
Well, that's another story because something more did come, but it's in the it has its place in the map, but it's recognizing the pinnacle of awake as sacred essence, as the golden conscious singularity, which is when we're really just completely integrated as the conscious manifest, not out of manifest, but the conscious manifest that is a singularity of realization that somehow is inclusive of all of that which has been realized and is source and the subtle manifest at the same time. So that's a story I've just recently told at the Thailand retreat, and it doesn't change anything I've described. It's not a new realization. Well, it actually is a realization, but I don't put it in that category because it's like the refined aspect of this, and it's given rise to some lovely mandala charts that I've created that shows transformation. Nothing to be done, but the transformation that occurs in essence, as sacred essence, finding its own singularity as creation, as sacred self, and as this infinite singularity that we've become. So that's a further story to be told. And if we find ourselves, as a group that are engaged, as humanity, those who are grasping the whole being nature of things, then it's an invitation for us to recognize the refinements that are occurring. And they've been occurring in our work for some people for a long time. But we've actually pretty much had no common language beyond whole being realization and some integration of it. And so these clarifications were not Rod going out and thinking it would be good to have a map. This was Rod writing a book with Ralph and then finding that because I'm a teacher, I like to express things in forms that I can communicate. And then each of these became crystallized. There was the emergence of creation in my experience, my own process and my own peculiar discriminative nature in which many of my awakenings happen in very distinctive incremental elements. To me, they're just gifts of my nature that were handy to have so that I could further describe to people all of the elements involved. Right from my whole being realization, I wanted to just jump in and get it because I've been a seeker all my life. It didn't work. I had to wait. And others were awakening, not me. But my awakening in whole being realization came in distinctive incremental shifts. First, it was consciousness. I realized consciousness as a field, as a nothing of awareness. Nothing meaning no preferences, no content, no material, just the field of awareness as self and other. And it shifted like that. It happened to shift during a long retreat in our work while gazing with a bunch of teachers. And then, and I recognized it as soon as it occurred because I'd been living with that consciousness for a long time because I was a meditator, teacher of meditation, but I hadn't discriminated its absolutely qualitatively qualitylessness of awareness. So when I realized that, it was like, oh, I know that, but I hadn't kind of got it. So then after our gazing in this long retreat, then everyone closed their eyes for a few minutes. That's what we were doing next. And I just sat there, kind of realizing the space that I already knew, but now I got kind of thing. And all of a sudden there was a remarkable and dramatic drop into my body. And I was a guy of my head, I was a very head guy. Well, this awareness center dropped right into my trunk of my body. the center of my trunk of my body. And it was like, oh my gosh, what just happened? It occurred like in a moment, and it even had a sound dimension of a thunk to it. I thought others would have heard it. I'm sure it wasn't audible, but it was audible to me. And then I'm sitting there in the continuation of just those few minutes, but it was like, oh my gosh, my center of awareness is now in my trunk of my body. And so after the gazing and that session we had, I started to realize that I'd never really got the gazing process. I'd never really felt much from it. And I'd been in the work for 6 months or so. And I didn't mind gazing, but I couldn't really say what it was doing for me. After that, every time I gazed, I could feel it in my body. From that point on, that's where it was. So I knew consciousness seated in the body, but I knew something was not there in our whole being realization. In our whole being realization, there's this non-separate inclusion. I could feel myself, that witness consciousness was now embodied, feeling witness consciousness. In other words, the realization of consciousness as embodiment, but I was still in a witnessing relationship with creation. I wanted it to stop because I knew that was what you needed for whole being realization, but I couldn't find any way to do that. It was like, I'm here, that's there. And it would become very distinctive at times. Sometimes I didn't notice it as much, but it became my project then. I want to finish this. And I came to realize that it was unfinishable. I didn't know how to do it. And it was clearly never going to happen, because if you don't know how to do it, how could it? So it wasn't going to happen. And eventually, after a good part of a year, I realized that I wasn't getting anywhere and that maybe I would just stop working in the waking down work at that time. However, I'd already signed up for the next long retreat that was a year later. So I decided in my good logic to go ahead with that, stay engaged until the retreat, and then quit these things. So I went to this long retreat, and it was so interesting. When I got there, I started feeling this embodied love bliss. It wasn't I hadn't had that whole being realization, because it was like a soup of warm love bliss. And we were supposed to be processing and bringing up our issues in small group, and I felt a bit guilty, like I can't access my pains. I know I have them, but I can't access them because I'm feeling pretty good. And so that lasted for that retreat, and it was murky. It was like a soup of me feeling good. Well, it turned out the next day it was in the Rocky Mountains at that trip in Estes Park, and so I needed to stay with a teacher in the area of Boulder, Denver, overnight before my flight would leave. And so I had to go to sleep that night and be ready to wake up at 4 a.m. when the shuttle would come to the door. So I kind of, just got everything ready. I went to sleep that night. I had an alarm. I got up, pulled on my clothes. The driver came. I went out to the van and went to sleep until the Denver airport. And then they woke me up. I got my suitcases. I ran in. I checked in, got rid of my bags, and then I'm going to the gate. And I'm walking down. Denver is a huge airport. Walking down this long, long channel, long hall, and I'm looking to the end of the hall, and I'm realizing I feel connected down there. It was such a shock and a surprise. It was like, oh my gosh, I'm in this field, and I felt vulnerable. It was like I'd always had my own private space, and then there were people walking by me in my space, included in my space. And so I was, it was really so strange. And I had this analogy that I often mention was, it felt like I'd always been watching people in a swimming pool through a glass window, watching everybody in the world. And now I was in the swimming pool with everybody. And it was delightful, and I felt vulnerable. It was a very peculiar thing. And of course, being my nature of an investigator, I felt like, okay, where is the witness? Let me see if I can bring it back. Can I feel separated? Well, I couldn't. So this is an example of how, I guess, my nature as a spiritual teacher all my adult life, and nature as an educator in my life, I benefit from this incremental opening, because it really helps me recognize the elements of our whole being realization. Well, it turns out that many or most of the other elements of these archetypal steps each would show up for me in a distinctive and individual way. So it's part of what you could say being was manifesting as somebody of that nature that somehow was empowered to describe these things in the company of an awakened other, in terms of Ralph and his profound background as a spiritual seeker and educated man, so that as these things arose, I could share them, express them, and then find that they felt right when I expressed them. Or I'd have questions and I could clarify and confirm them. So they just all feel like a gift to me and a gift to humans who want to find this unfolding, discriminatively aware, because this whole being realization is not just a something happened and I don't care. The whole being realization is a discriminative joy to realize the conscious field, the embodied field, and the mutual field. So that goes on as we unfold. And just our interest and curiosity as creation is evolving at this time with humans in a brand new way, in my opinion. A paradigm that is of whole being, embodied, sacred realization. And it's a joy for me to have been a part of that process, and it's a joy for me if others find it useful in whatever ways they might. Thanks, Ardith. Thank you. Well, lovely to talk with you about it. It was fun for me. And I can't hear you, Cynthia. Did you say something, Cynthia? Or?
You said it was fun for you, and I said we could tell.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing that delight with us.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, so this is our time, and we get to go spend the rest of the evening, and we'll see you either in the early morning event or in our regular morning event, and I'll look forward to that time together.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rod.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Rod.
Bye, everyone.
Thank Rod.
Yeah, bye.
Bye, everybody.
Night, everyone.